Light falls at a low angle, pale and oblique, filtering through ancient skies thick with moisture and volcanic haze. It reaches a quiet coastline, somewhere near the pale tropics of a Devonian world that does not yet know vertebrate life on land. Here, the sea curls inward, becoming thin, branching arms of saltwater shallows that lace the fringes of an old continent. In these soft tidal flats and mud-bottomed estuaries, the water warms in pools and channels, disturbed only by the ripple of wind or the passing of a silent swimmer. The sediment is dark and rich with detritus, fine silt, broken plants, the castings of worms. Bacterial mats stain the surface in green and purples, and the first-rooted plants, simple vascular pioneers, anchor into the shoreline, their slender stems waving just above the waterline. They breathe through pores in waxless leaves and draw water upward through tubes no thicker than a hair. This is not yet a forest, not yet a land filled with crawling things. But it is no longer lifeless, and the sunlight, pale as it is, has begun to matter. Below, life moves more slowly than sound. The water holds warmth through long Devonian days, its clarity clouded with suspended matter and the drifting shapes of ancient fish. Many are armoured, their bodies covered in bony plates like living fossils already hardened against a world that has not yet grown teeth. Others drift with mouth agape, filtering algae and microbe-rich plankton through gill arches, never stopping, never looking up. Jawless, directionless, unchanged for millions of years, they are not the ones that will crawl. Instead, it is among their cousins, primitive-jawed fishes, that the earlier shift begins. These Sarcopterygians, or lobe-finned fishes, carry within them a subtle difference. Their fins are thick and fleshy, anchored to bones that articulate at joints. The architecture is internal, hidden beneath muscle, but it is familiar. A humerus, a radius, a cluster of tiny digital bones. They do not yet reach beyond the water, but already, unknowingly, they echo the limbs to come. As they drift through brackish lagoons or press against bottom silt to pivot their bodies, these fish begin to use their fins as props, bracing not for stride but for balance. There is no need to lift, no concept of walking, but the motion changes all the same. No eyes witness this transition with foresight. No intention marks it. But somewhere in the gentle murk of a coastal stream, the weight of a body shifts subtly forward. A fin presses into the sediment, bearing more weight than it once did. The spine bends slightly upward, not to rise but to adjust. The mud gives way slowly, yielding to the pressure of flesh, the hint of a shoulder. The air above these shallows is heavy and still. Clouds pass in slow processions, trailing shadow over tidal mud. There is no birdsong here, no insects chirping. Above the surface, the world is quieter than water. When the wind stills, all that remains is the occasional crack of a drying plant stalk, or the distant hiss of surf retreating. There is no need to listen, but ears are beginning to form. At the edges of perception, structures inside the skulls of some fishes begin to shift. Tiny bones once used to brace the jaw now respond to vibration. The stapes, still primitive, will one day transmit airborne sound. But now it rests, inert, surrounded by tissues attuned only to pressure and resonance underwater. Sometimes the pools warm too much. In the shallowest hollows where the tide leaves behind warmth and stillness, oxygen levels dip in the heat. Water here becomes breathless, depleted. In such moments, some fish rise toward the surface and gulp. They draw air not for sound or scent, but survival. An early lung born of a modified swim bladder becomes a quiet emergency valve. These are not lungs for running, not lungs for calling, but lungs for waiting. for enduring in the stillness. These lungs do not fill quickly. They are sacs, simple and slow. They do not flutter, they do not speak. They are not used until they must be. Yet here, at the edge of land, they are a quiet promise. Air is not yet a medium of motion, but of delay, of surviving one more tide, one more drought, one more pool too still to breathe. There is irony in their setting, limbs forming in a place with nowhere to walk, lungs inflating in a world without clean air, and eyes beginning to shift in creatures who never look beyond the shallows. Still, evolution does not need foresight. It does not work toward ends. It accumulates, quietly, blindly, on the edge of possibility. Where once gills sufficed, now a dual system begins. Where fins once only steered, now they push. And where the water once flowed clean and deep, now it stagnates and compels change. The first vascular plants nearby reach just knee-height on an imagined viewer, casting no real shade but offering texture to the land. They thicken the soil and alter the runoff, changing the chemistry of streams and softening banks that once collapsed into the sea. Their roots do not grip tightly, but they hold enough to make sediment more stable, allowing tidal pools to linger longer, evaporate slower. In their presence, the fish who brush the bottom stay in the shallows longer, not because they choose to, but because the landscape holds them there. The tides press in and out with no regard for ambition. Pools form, heat, deplete, and vanish. And in each cycle, a subtle sorting takes place. Those with stronger lungs linger longer, those with flatter fins hold balance better. The difference is small, nearly invisible, but over geologic time it is enough. And there, the silence of land is absolute. It is not hostile, but indifferent. Without atmospheric sound or the swirl of aquatic life, stepping out means entering stillness. Above the waterline there is light and wind, but no guidance, no familiar cue to follow. For now, that threshold is rarely crossed, but it is noticed. A surface is not only a boundary, it is an invitation, slow and undeciphered. The fish do not know they are near a transition. The mud does not register the weight of limbs pressed down instead of fins swept sideways. But in these flats where light grazes shallow tides and air thickens above warm pools, something irreversible has begun. The water deepens slightly inland, just enough to slow the current into a hush. Beneath a canopy of silent algae and loosely draped plant stems, a new kind of movement begins, subtle, deliberate, and oriented not by speed, but by pressure. Fins press not to propel forward, but to hold, to shift, to adjust the angle of a resting body in thick, silted stillness. The lobe-finned fishes here, ancient Sarcopterygians, do not glide as their pelagic ancestors did. Their motion is uncertain, often paused. The substrate beneath them is soft, easily disturbed, but it offers something new, resistance. Where the water above is quiet, the floor below is firm enough to push against, yet forgiving enough not to wound. And so the fins, no longer just paddles, begin to feel. Their lobes sense gradients, pressure, hesitation. This is not walking, it is contact. A learning not of locomotion but of presence. Their skeletons, still more cartilage than bone, yield in places yet stiffen in others. The jointed internal structure of their fins becomes increasingly distinct. Bony segments surrounded by layers of muscle, embedded in tissue that responds to both gravity and buoyancy. Some individuals, through random variants, have slightly stronger linkages at the base of their fins. These allow for longer bracing, longer pauses, the ability to remain partially upright in the substrate without drifting sideways or sinking into the muck. In evolutionary time, even the slightest shift in posture can matter. A degree of lift, a momentary steadiness, Small changes that, compounded over generations, will alter the architecture of movement. These fish inhabit marginal waters, brackish inlets, estuarine spillways, ephemeral streams fed by seasonal rains. In times of flood, the waters connect and swell, sweeping nutrients and life through vast wetlands. In drier months, these same channels become isolated pockets, warming, thickening, lowering in oxygen. Here, those with more robust fins can reach cooler sediments, orient toward shade, push toward pockets of fresher water. Their motion is not yet directed toward land, but it leans gently that way, not purposefully, not consciously, simply through slow inheritance. The light in these environments does not penetrate far. It scatters quickly in the suspended silt, turning gold to brown, blue to green. In this dusky space, vision adapts as well. Eyes shift slightly upward on the head, gaining a clearer view of the surface film and the shifting play of light above it. They do not yet watch the land, but they trace its reflections. Glints of fern, the ripple of a breeze over leaves, the dark edge of a fallen branch in the shallows, all of it seen from below as abstract shapes. The eyes do not seek these images, but they register them, and in the way evolution works, without thought, without destination, those who register better begin to endure more. The bottom dwellers feed in slow bursts, using broad jaws to scoop invertebrates from the sediment or dislodge them from decaying plant matter. In these acts, the fins stabilize the body, preventing sideways slip or unwanted roll. Some species evolve a slight upward tilt in the neck, a hinge-like motion that allows the head to lift while the body remains in place. It is not yet a neck as it will be defined later, but the rudiment is there. Motion separated from the spine, gaze untethered from direction of travel. This disarticulation, this first flicker of anatomical independence, will matter. But for now, it means only this. A fish can stay where it is and still look upward. Dry irony lingers here, softly embedded in each change. Legs form where there are no paths. A neck begins to lift in a world that offers nothing to see, and muscle strengthens in limbs that cannot yet carry. These creatures will never know what their bones are beginning to imply. No lineage remains to look back, but the traces are clear in fossilized cross-sections of rock. The articulation of joints, the beginnings of digits, the careful layering of bone that speaks to use rather than drift. Around these waters the land is quiet but changing. Primitive plants spread slowly across floodplains, club mosses, horsetails, rhiniophytes, anchoring themselves in nutrient-rich soils and shading small patches of ground. They alter the landscape in subtle ways. Their root systems reduce erosion, their stems trap sediment, their death returns carbon to the ground. Over time, this encourages the formation of firmer banks and more stable microhabitats. The fish who dwell in the margins now find less collapsing earth, more defined edges, longer-lasting puddles. Each plant, in its own slow rhythm, nudges the transition onward, not by guidance, but by structure. The internal air sacs, early lungs, become more reliable in these unstable waters. Gulping becomes less a rare emergency and more a part of daily function. These sacs evolve gradually, branching into compartments that increase surface area and improve oxygen diffusion. Not all species possess them, not all survive the warmest months. Those who do leave behind traces, fossilized impressions of lung cavities, slight asymmetries in ribcage structure, tiny ridges along bone where musculature once supported movement not of swimming, but of lifting. Still, they do not crawl. They do not yet breach the surface with intent. But sometimes, during late dusk, as shadows deepen across the shallows, one of them shifts closer to the edge. A current slows. A fin presses down. The body moves not forward, but slightly up. For a moment, the weight transfers across 4 points instead of the fluid buoyancy of swimming. It does not last long. The pull of gravity is unfamiliar, and the skin is not yet suited for dry air, but the motion is recorded in the musculature in the memory of use passed down through generations. This moment, so small, so nearly imperceptible, carries in it the quiet paradox of transition. Movement before motive, structure before necessity, change without knowing what for. It is here, in the still backwaters of a continent with no name, that fins begin to brush the bottom in ways that no ancestor had done before. And though nothing stirs on the land to welcome them, the shape of the future is already pressing faintly against the mud. Rain falls on an ancient landmass, carried by seasonal winds that trace long arcs across the proto-continents. The sky is dense with water vapor and cloud, and when the storms come, they do not arrive with violence but with endurance. For days, sometimes weeks, warm monsoonal rains settle over the inland lowlands, flooding valleys and overflowing rivers. The terrain holds no deep channels yet. Instead, water spreads wide and thin, collecting in low depressions, carving oxbow curves into the landscape, shaping broad floodplains filled with standing pools. These transient wetlands shift constantly, appearing and vanishing with the seasons. In this world, the difference between river and land is often only a question of time. Here, in the slow heart of the Devonian tropics, life is organized by water's rhythm, not its permanence. Pools form where last year there was dry ground. Lakes shrink to ponds and return to swamp. In this environment of flux, a particular challenge arises: the instability of oxygen. Still waters, rich with decomposing matter and warmed by the sun, begin to lose their ability to support gill breathing alone. The deeper the pool, the darker and more breathless its bottom. Fish caught in these places face a quiet suffocation, but some rise toward the surface and draw air, not because they want to, because they must. Within them, the early lung has become more complex. Born from the swim bladder, once a structure for buoyancy, this organ has adapted to capture air directly. Thin walls, moist and vascular, allow oxygen to enter the bloodstream without the help of gills. This shift is not total. Gills still dominate. But in times of low oxygen, during droughts or heat, the lung offers a second route to survival. It is a redundancy that matters. Some fish, through minor anatomical differences, begin to rely more frequently on this capacity. Their behavior shifts. They hover near the surface, linger under shaded banks, learn to recognize the gradient of oxygen in the water column. There is no awareness in this, only survival. But in the patterns of survival, anatomy begins to follow. The rain eventually stops. The water recedes. Pools become smaller, warmer, more turbid. In these shrinking habitats, the fish that can endure low oxygen gain a quiet advantage. Over time, they are the ones who reproduce more consistently, who leave more offspring behind, and those offspring carry slightly improved lungs, not larger, but more efficient, not new, but refined. The change is slow, impossible to notice in a single generation, but the record remains in the sediment, in the chemical traces of ancient respiration, and in the rare fossils that show expanded lung cavities nestled beside shrinking gill arches. Outside the pools, the landscape is thick with early plant life. Fern-like leaves, spore-bearing stalks, rootless thickets of club mosses and hornworts. They do not form forests yet, but they are no longer isolated. They stretch for kilometers across low terrain, altering humidity and soil chemistry. Their roots, if they can be called that, anchor into mud and detritus, breaking up rock and binding earth. This stabilizes the edges of ponds and slows erosion. In turn, the pools last longer after the rains, becoming semi-permanent oases where water remains even as nearby ground dries. For the fish within them, this means a longer window of survival, but also more pressure on oxygen. There is irony again in this layered dependence. Lungs form where water lingers, but lingered water is what drives their necessity. Plants stabilize the banks, but in doing so create the low oxygen pools that push vertebrates to the surface. A cycle of constraint and relief emerges, not as design, but as consequence. In these places, breath becomes uncertain, and because of that uncertainty, the mechanics of air breathing become quietly indispensable. Sometimes the lungs are not enough. The fish rest motionless near the surface, their bodies barely moving, fins outspread to balance against shallow water. Some die, gasping slowly beneath a film of green algae. Others survive by the faint margin their lungs afford them. These moments of ecological pressure do not announce themselves. They do not create drama. They leave no violence in the fossil record, but they exert the weight of time, pressing gently on every generation that follows. Within the bodies of these survivors, subtle changes accumulate. The internal tissues of the lungs thicken and branch. New folds emerge, increasing surface area. The circulatory system adapts, redirecting more blood toward the lungs when oxygen in the water is scarce. Sensory systems begin to respond to carbon dioxide buildup, triggering instinctual ascents to the surface. These are not leaps. There is no breach, no sudden motion, only the slow upward drift of a fish trained by generations to feel the thinning of the water and respond by rising toward air. This process carries a quiet contradiction. Air is more abundant in oxygen than water, yet it is also more dangerous. The surface exposes soft tissues to dryness, to ultraviolet light, to the unfamiliar boundary of gravity. Early air breathers solve this not by venturing onto land, but by staying half submerged, sipping air in shallow pools, lungs inflating in the protected wet margins of the world. They live at the edge of two mediums, never fully leaving one, never fully entering the other. Their bodies begin to reflect this in-between state. Scales remain thick and protective, but patches of skin develop more blood vessels just beneath the surface. These areas help absorb oxygen directly from the air or from water-soaked surfaces. The evolution of cutaneous respiration, the ability to breathe through skin, is not dramatic. It does not replace lungs. But it adds redundancy, another layer of insurance in a world where water and breath cannot be trusted. Even now they do not crawl, they do not seek land nor fear it. But in the shrinking pools of the Devonian, the slow sculpting of anatomy continues. A lung, no longer merely an emergency organ, begins to shape the rhythms of life. A creature rises toward the surface not just for survival, but because its body has made the surface familiar. There is no transformation yet, no crossing of thresholds, but in the silence between floods, where water stills and breath grows shallow, a vertebrate lifts its head, not to see, not to walk, but to draw in air. In the hush beneath a Devonian pool, cartilage begins to gather purpose. Not quickly, not with certainty, but gradually. Soft tissues thickening, reinforcing, redefining the edges of movement. What once served simply to guide a fin through water now starts to articulate. Skeletal segments arrange themselves in new relation. There is no plan, no direction, but over deep time, cartilage stiffens where pressure is greatest, at the base of fins, along the shoulders, near the hinge of the skull. These are not yet bones as we know them, but they are more than scaffolding. They're hints of the future written in slow repetition. The joints that form are shallow and limited, allowing only small rotations, slow pivots in the mud. But even this changes everything. A fish no longer needs to swim to shift its weight. It can lean, it can brace, it can press against a surface and hold its shape for a moment longer. In these brackish, vegetated margins where fine sediment collects in gentle layers and decaying plant matter darkens the water, the ground underfoot is neither solid nor liquid. It is compressible, forgiving, and thick. In this environment, the ability to stabilize, however imperfectly, becomes an edge. Fins that splay outward like paddles spread weight more broadly. Their fleshy lobes, muscular and dense, begin to operate as levers rather than flaps, and inside them, cartilage lines up into columns, forming rough analogues to digits. The bones are not yet separate, not jointed in the way toes will one day be, but they cluster near the end of the fin like the scattered thoughts of a limb. These changes are not uniform. In some lineages, fins remain narrow, better suited for open water. In others, particularly those lingering in shallow pools and drying streams, the spread of support structures at the base of the fin allows for subtle differences in posture. Some individuals can tilt their torsos slightly upward. Others can shift laterally with more control. Each variation, small and often invisible, accumulates under the pressure of environment. It is not that evolution designs these forms. It cannot. It selects among what is already there. In this way, cartilage becomes joint, and joint becomes a hinge upon which weight can briefly rest. Above the waterline, the world is inert. The air is still and smells of decomposing leaves, of sulphur, of damp stone warmed by diffuse sunlight. There is no animal noise, no territorial calls or mating displays. The land is filled with forms, but not yet with movement. Ferns spread in quiet blankets across floodplains. Their leaves curl slowly in the heat, and sporangia release spores into the wind without ceremony. Nothing watches, nothing eats them. Their structure is not yet defined by the pressure of predation, only by the rhythm of wet and dry. At the pool's edge, a fish lingers. Its body rests partly on silt, partly in water. One fin presses downward, not out of intent, but because it happens to brace better than the other. The slight lift it creates is not sustained, but it is enough to shift the flow of blood, to engage muscles in a new configuration. These moments are not decisive. They are tentative, almost accidental. Yet every one is an opportunity for anatomy to try something it could not before. The shoulder girdle, once fused tightly to the skull, begins to loosen. In early fishes, the head and trunk form a rigid unit. Turning is a function of the whole body. But in shallow water, where maneuvering space is limited and the need to remain still is high, this connection becomes a constraint. Over time, in some species, the bones that connect the head to the pectoral girdle weaken. Gaps appear, filled by softer tissue. A new possibility emerges. The head can move without the body. It is a subtle separation, not yet a functional neck, but it allows for one part of the skeleton to shift while the other remains anchored. This independence will become essential for life outside water, where mobility and perception must work in tandem. But for now it is only a softness between bones. Another irony takes shape here. Mobility begins with disconnection. What will one day allow a creature to lift its head toward sound, to turn its gaze toward threat, begins simply as a weakening of fusion. The price of this change is borne silently. We do not know if it causes discomfort or if some forms failed because of it. The fossil record remembers only what endures. Inside the body, other structures adjust in parallel. The vertebral column thickens, developing bony arches that help resist compression. The ribs broaden, forming shallow curves that encase organs. This provides support against gravity, though the animals have not yet left the water. The difference lies in how they interact with the bottom, how they rest, how they shift from place to place. No longer simply suspended in water, these creatures begin to feel the shape of their own weight. The sensory systems adapt quietly. Lateral lines, mechanosensory organs that detect vibration in water, become less reliable in shallows, where disturbance is constant. In response, some lineages begin to rely more heavily on vision, on the directionality of light and shadow. The eyes grow slightly forward-facing, allowing for more overlap in their fields of view. This shift improves depth perception, though there is little to see but mud and root. Still, these changes matter. Seeing is not yet about pursuit or defense. It is about presence, being oriented in a space where movement is no longer entirely fluid. The first finger bones do not yet articulate. They are embedded within the fin, bound in tissue, unmoving, but they are there. In fossil beds like those of the Canadian Arctic or Greenland, preserved in silt and flattened over eons, these nascent digits tell of creatures who pressed down rather than swam. Each one is a record of a pressure point, a response to the uncertainty of soft ground and the need for brief distributed contact. And so cartilage gathers, thickens, separates. Not to lift, not yet to stride, only to hold for a moment longer. A joint, after all, is a pause before movement. In the stillness of a Devonian pool, the body begins to hold its shape differently. It does not know what it is becoming. It only presses against the earth and finds that the earth presses back. The surface of the water is still, a mirror stretched across silence, broken only by the slow ripple of a fin or the soft arc of a breathing rise. Above it, there is air, unmoving, nearly tasteless, thin, and silence, a kind of emptiness that surrounds rather than echoes. In the water, sound travels well. Vibrations ripple outward from the smallest movement, filling the world with cues. But above the surface, the pressure changes. Air holds sound differently, faster, more fleeting, less forgiving. It does not carry the long, low frequencies of aquatic life. It offers no ready channel for the lateral line, no useful map for a creature whose senses are tuned to the compression of water. And yet, the surface remains there, crossed by light, disrupted by rain, brightened by the slow passing of sun and cloud. It marks a boundary that some creatures now frequent, not with their whole bodies, but with the rising arc of a head or the upward tilt of a jaw. Some of the fish now linger near this interface, not just for breath but for orientation. Their eyes turn upward, scanning the shimmering distortion of sky above them. Their bodies, pressed low into the silty shallows, barely move, held in place by splayed fins and the patient gravity of warm water. And in their skulls, quiet changes are taking shape. The bones at the rear of the head, those that once braced the gill arches, that once reinforced the joint between jaw and cranium, begin to shift in function. No longer needed for the same support, they are co-opted, pulled into new configurations by the slow drift of natural variation. One of these bones, the mandibular, finds a new use. As it loses its role in the mechanics of feeding, it becomes a bridge, a conduit for vibration. This is the beginning of a middle ear, not yet a true ear, not yet a chambered structure tuned to airborne sound, but a hint of one. The stapes, small and delicate, begins to transmit motion from the outside of the head to the fluid-filled inner ear. In water, this change means little. The body is already surrounded by pressure waves. But in air, where sound arrives as pressure differentials through a vastly thinner medium, such transmission becomes essential. It is not effective yet. These creatures cannot truly hear in air. but their anatomy is turning softly toward that possibility. There is no song in the Devonian air, no voice calls out. There are no predators to stalk with silence, no prey to startle with noise, but air is no longer empty. Wind moves over ferns, dry leaves click against one another, distant water flows in the next bend of a stream. These are faint sounds, accidental and unmeasured, but they exist. The capacity to sense them, however weakly, is a quiet step toward land. The irony is persistent. The first bones to hear were once bones that helped bite. Jaws, in their earliest forms, did not evolve for predation but for respiration, to open and close the mouth in coordination with gill ventilation. That which once opened the path for water will eventually open the path for sound. In this way, even the act of hearing is born from the need to breathe. At the same time, vision adapts not just to light but to the way it bends. In water, light refracts differently, entering the eye at slower speeds and narrowing the field of view. Above the surface, where light moves faster, the same eyes lose precision. The lens must adapt. Some early air-breathing fishes begin to develop flattened corneas, more suitable for aerial focus. Their eyes shift slightly upward and outward, allowing them to scan above the surface while the rest of the body remains submerged. These changes, like all others, are incremental, subtle accumulations with no goal. But over time, the fish that orient more effectively at the water's edge find more food, avoid more hazards, linger longer in oxygen-rich shallows. They are not terrestrial, but they are no longer purely aquatic. The skull responds accordingly. Its bones thicken and fuse along new lines of stress. Openings appear in different locations to accommodate new muscle attachments or reduce weight. The upper jaw begins to detach more fully from the cranium, increasing gape size, allowing for a wider range of motion. These changes do not announce themselves. They do not arrive as innovations, but as tolerances, new forms that persist because they work just well enough. In the fossil record, these skulls appear as fragments, flattened impressions in ancient sediments, their contours pressed into stone by the weight of mud and time. Some show wide orbits, some the faint outline of a spiracle, a small hole behind the eye that will eventually evolve into an ear canal. Others show the earliest form of a notch where the stapes may have rested. Each one tells a quiet story of a creature sensing the world differently, adjusting to the strange threshold between water and air. The aquatic world remains full of cues, current, pressure, chemical traces, but air is a void to these creatures, a space without texture. Those who can glean even a little information from above have an advantage, however slight. A shift in light, a shadow cast across the pool, the faint rustle of movement near the bank. None of these things yet demand response, but they are there, and the ability to perceive them, even dimly, begins to shape behavior. The stillness of land is not emptiness. It is simply unmeasured, unoccupied by vertebrate life. Yet the silence above the water is a silence that begins to offer meaning, not a call to action, but a canvas on which the first faint impressions are made, air that carries breath, light that favours wide-set eyes, sound that touches bones once meant for feeding. In this way, the skull becomes a house of transformation, not all at once, but gradually through rearrangement, thickening, separation. A head once bound to the torso by fused plates begins to pivot, to sense, to balance independently. It is a quiet shift, more mechanical than behavioral, but in time it will allow these creatures to look around rather than simply forward, to remain still and still perceive, and still they do not step onto land. But in the shallows, in the half-submerged edge between stream and soil, the head rises a little higher. The eyes break the surface more often. The spiral of adaptation continues, not because the creatures want to hear or see or breathe air, but because the pressures of their world nudge them endlessly toward possibility. In the silted shallows of a late Devonian floodplain, the sun falls at low angles, casting long patterns across still water, tracing shadows of plants that do not yet form forests, and of bodies that almost rise from the surface. In this place, quiet pools warm under heavy air. Nothing stirs the water except the slow drift of sediment, the breath of an air gulper, the movement of something more than a fish, but less than what will come. Here, in the soft hollows of an ancient river delta that once lay near the edge of what is now the Arctic, a fossil will one day be preserved. It will flatten under layers of mud, crushed over eons, but it will keep its shape. When uncovered, it will show features no other known creature had. An intermediary not imagined but embedded in stone. This is where Tiktaalik waits, not as a character, not as a moment, but as a body shaped by its world, long before it ever left a trace in ours. In these pools, Tiktaalik is unremarkable to the world around it. The Devonian sky offers no recognition, the sediment no ceremony. But its body contains answers that had not yet been asked. A skull with mobile joints, a neck that allows the head to lift and pivot without moving the trunk, broad ribs capable of supporting weight, and fins with bones that resemble a primitive wrist. Not built for walking, but no longer just for swimming. These limbs still end in rays, no digits yet visible, but they are capable of pressing downward, spreading weight across the substrate in a new geometry. This is not stride, not even true support, but it is lift, a simple act. The chest raised from the bottom, the head tilted toward dry air. It happens in brief moments, in shallow pools that evaporate more quickly than they fill, in low places where oxygen thins in the heat of the day. The body of Tiktaalik lies long and flat, a compromise between water and land. Its scales remain, but they are thinner, more flexible. Its eyes sit atop the head, not at the sides, and they point slightly upward. When submerged, it sees the shimmer of the surface. When half emerged, it sees the silence of land. This orientation, passive and observational, changes how the creature meets its environment. The lateral line system, so essential for navigation and sensing in water, is no longer sufficient. Above the surface, where air carries no vibration that such a system can detect, other senses must begin to compensate. The eyes widen, the skull rearranges. Small changes, barely functional at first, lay the groundwork for an entirely different kind of perception. Its spiracles, openings behind the eyes, are larger than in its ancestors. They may allow the intake of air directly to the lungs, bypassing the mouth. This arrangement hints at a shift in respiratory behavior, a gradual reliance on atmospheric oxygen, not just as emergency backup, but as an integrated feature of daily life. Still, gills remain. Lungs are not the only method, and they do not replace what came before. In Tiktaalik, duality defines existence. Water and air, fins and wrists, stillness and lift. There is no transformation, only overlap. In the landscape around it, the vegetation grows denser than in earlier periods. Rhiniophytes and club mosses rise above the flat plain, forming clusters of green that slow the wind and shade the ground. Their roots, though shallow, weave into the soil and slow erosion. They gather along stream banks, reducing runoff, allowing pools to persist through dry spells. These same banks, now firm enough to bear brief contact, offer surfaces where a creature like Tiktaalik might haul slightly forward. Not far, not upright, but more than before. There is no walking, but there is traction. Fins, spread outward and flattened against the earth, slide less. A body pressed from below rises slightly. In this posture, a new kind of balance emerges. The ribs support the internal organs. The shoulder girdle, once locked to the skull, moves independently. The neck turns, and though the limbs do not articulate as legs, they press downward, forming static points around which the torso shifts. For a moment the animal is held up by 4 anchors, not suspended by water, but resisting gravity. This shift in itself creates a new experience. Weight as something felt not just passively but through structure. Nothing in this motion suggests future mobility. It is not a rehearsal for walking. It is an answer to a temporary need, to hold still while drawing breath, to stay close to the surface when the pool begins to stagnate. Yet it leaves an impression, not on intention, but on anatomy. Over time, the muscles that brace during these lifts strengthen. The bones at the base of the fins expand. Ligaments form along new stress lines. Wrists begin as stabilizers, not hinges, and in their structure they reflect the softness of this transition. Not a leap, but a leaning. Even the fossils do not fully capture this. Flattened under pressure, they lose depth and detail. Yet in their arrangement, in the articulation of humerus, radius, ulna, and a fan of bones beyond, scientists see the quiet origin of a body built to rise. Tiktaalik is not an ancestor of all tetrapods, but it is part of the lineage, one of many experimenting with life near the margin. Its presence marks not a point, but a gradient. There is again a soft irony. A neck emerges where no gaze is needed. Wrists form where there is no terrain to grip. Ribs grow stronger where the world remains horizontal. Each innovation, if it can be called that, begins as a side effect. A drift of structure shaped not by foresight, but by constraint. The land does not beckon, but the body adjusts to pressures that water alone can no longer resolve. Above the pools the light fades. Evening comes slowly in the Devonian, drawn out by the angle of the sun and the clarity of the ancient sky. Tiktaalik, half submerged, rests against the bank, its fins spread wide, chest lifted slightly, head turned. Not walking, not yet even crawling, but still, pressing, still, leaning. And for a moment it is held not by water, but by its own strength, and the ground beneath it holds firm. The water withdraws, not in an instant, not in a flood or dramatic vanishing, but in the slow rhythm of seasonal change. Pools evaporate under heavy sun, leaving behind patches of cracked silt and darkened soil, where green algae dries into crust. Where once a current trickled between banks, now there is only dampness, a shallow imprint of what had flowed. The creatures within these pools are not stranded all at once. They are left behind incrementally, as water recedes inch by inch. Some follow the fading current, their bodies pulled downstream toward deeper refuge. Others remain, not by choice, but because their bodies allow it, because their limbs can press, because their skin, though fragile, can tolerate air for just a little longer, because they carry within them a partial solution to the absence of buoyancy, a skeleton thickened to bear weight. In these drying pools, weight becomes more than a consequence. It becomes a defining force. Gravity, once held at bay by water's support, now asserts itself with clarity. The vertebral column must do more than link nerves. It must bear down. In creatures like Tiktaalik, the spine responds by forming stronger neural arches, supporting the body's frame with a stiffness absent in earlier aquatic forms. The ribs grow wider and more curved, creating a shallow cage that distributes pressure and protects delicate organs from collapse. In deep water, such strength is unnecessary. But in transition, in the mud, in the shallows, in moments when the body must lift itself even slightly. These reinforcements make the difference between stillness and motion. The limbs, still fin-like in many respects, are splayed to the sides. Their orientation does not permit efficient walking. Instead, movement is a sequence of weight shifts. One fin braces, the body swivels, the opposite fin finds purchase, and the cycle repeats. It is a crawl not of rhythm, but of patience. Forward motion may be only inches at a time, the belly dragging, the head low. But the posture changes everything. It creates friction, and from friction, resistance. The animal is no longer drifting, it is anchored. It feels where the ground gives and where it holds. This tactile feedback shapes behavior even before it shapes anatomy. Over generations, stronger muscles form at the base of each limb, their fibers aligning to resist compression and twist. Bones thicken along load-bearing axes. Wrists and ankles become broader, more stable. Not for stride, not yet, but for bearing. This development happens across multiple lineages. Acanthostega, Ichthyostega, and others, names assigned later to fossils that will lie embedded in Greenland's Devonian rock, show variations on the same theme. Some remain largely aquatic, their limbs used primarily for maneuvering in dense vegetation. Others begin to venture onto wet land surfaces, their digits spreading like spokes to distribute weight. Each adapts differently, yet all share one feature: the need to carry their bodies where water no longer flows. The environment cooperates not by design, but by contingency. The lowland terrain is soft, muddy floodplains, peat-rich soils, the margins of meandering rivers. These offer no stones to climb, no hills to crest, but they also offer no sharp drop-offs or dry cliffs. They are forgiving places, where a creature can collapse forward and still find water nearby, where failure is rarely fatal, and the edge of habitability shifts by degrees. The earliest ventures onto land are not leaps. They are slow driftings, awkward staggers onto damp surfaces only a few centimetres above the receding tide. In such places, posture becomes language. The way a body holds itself when half supported by the earth signals its capability. The way a fin flexes inward, the way a shoulder folds beneath weight, the way a rib cage lifts slightly to allow the lungs more room. Each of these actions, minor in isolation, composes a vocabulary of movement that evolution slowly reads and rewrites. There is irony in abundance. Limbs become stronger where there is still nowhere to go. The pelvis begins to broaden, forming a more stable link to the spine, even as the hind limbs remain poor at propulsion. The shoulder girdle detaches further from the skull, permitting finer adjustment of the forelimbs, though there is nothing yet to pursue or escape from. These shifts occur not in response to terrestrial life, but in response to liminal life, half in, half out. Gravity does not demand complete emergence to shape the body. It only requires enough exposure, long enough, for structure to matter. Inside the body, lungs adapt as well. In the absence of gill function during excursions onto land, blood flow must reroute. A primitive form of pulmonary circulation begins to take shape, separating the flow to and from the lungs from that of the rest of the body. It is not yet a closed system, but it creates pressure differences that help regulate oxygen intake. Over time, heart structure reflects this with subtle changes. Thicker walls, separated chambers, valves more responsive to changes in posture and environment. Again, this is not evolution toward a goal, but toward resilience, toward making each breath more certain in a world that no longer guarantees it. No sound marks these early crossings. There is no splash, no thud of step, no vocal cry. The creatures that press forward from the water do so without announcement. Their movements are small, muffled by wet ground, obscured by fern and horsetail. Even when they return to water, and most do regularly throughout life, the memory of land lingers in their bodies. Muscles remain stronger, lungs larger, limbs more articulate. The genome records these pressures, not as a story, but as a trend. The footprints left behind are shallow, uncertain. In some fossil beds they may one day be found, trails pressed into soft mud, then dried and buried by sediment, preserved not as intent but as contact. These are not strides. They are sequences of impression, where the body drags and the limbs press, where digits fan out to stabilize rather than push off. Yet they are unmistakable. A creature has moved where fish did not, and so weight becomes a companion, not a burden to be escaped, but a constant to be managed. It sculpts bone and posture alike. In a world where water retreats and returns with seasonal breath, those who can feel their weight without collapse endure. Crawling does not require intent, only friction, only time, only the silence of a world where the rules of movement are being rewritten by silt and breath. Across the low plains of the Devonian interior, something spreads that did not spread before. It is not movement, but matter. Green, thin, and reaching. Plants, once scattered along the water's edge in sparse colonies, now carpet the land in patches dense enough to hold soil. They remain small, mostly under a metre tall, but together they transform the world. Lycophytes, zosterophils, early horsetails, none cast shade, yet they weave a texture into the terrain that was once bare. Their stems are hollow, their leaves primitive, their roots shallow. But their presence anchors sediment, absorbs nutrients, alters the chemistry of runoff. Rain no longer flows over rock. It filters through organic layers, slows, stagnates, and pools. The air above grows heavier with water vapour and spores. In this green dampness the land does not welcome animal life, but it prepares for it, quietly, by accident. This landscape is unlike anything that came before. There are no flowers, no fruits, no wood. The flora does not yet form forests, but its density alters everything. It softens the banks of streams, giving structure to what would otherwise erode. It changes the oxygen content of air, pushing levels gradually upward as photosynthesis scales with coverage, and it builds, unintentionally, a new kind of ecological scaffolding. The plants provide no food for vertebrates. They do not yet host insects or birds or grazing mammals, but their very presence stabilizes the land into something more than terrain. It becomes habitat. Within this new texture the light is filtered. Above the surface of the water, where eyes once saw only sky or sun's reflection, now shadows flicker. Leaves interrupt the direct line of sunlight. The shade cools some pools, prolonging their lifespan. Other areas dry faster, forming cracked mud and shallow basins. This patchwork of conditions favours adaptation. Some of the semi-aquatic vertebrates begin to respond not only to moisture but to microhabitat, choosing shaded hollows over open puddles, bracing against rooted stems to lift themselves in search of still damp earth. They do not forage, they do not seek, but their bodies now exist in dialogue with the land's variability. The limbs they use are not tools, not even extensions of desire. They are levers of slow transition, pressed outward from a body still shaped by water. These limbs bend outward, not beneath. The gait is sprawling, awkward, energy inefficient. But it suffices for crawling. Digits begin to articulate more clearly. 8 in some species, 7 or 6 in others, not yet specialized, but sufficient for fanning across soft surfaces. The bones are long and thin, encased in soft tissue without nails or claws or grip. Their purpose is to distribute pressure, to prevent sinking into the soil, to remain atop the surface even when movement stalls. The pelvis continues its slow expansion. Where once the hind limbs were loosely attached to a floating girdle, now the hip begins to anchor to the spine. This connection, still partial, creates new vectors of force, allowing the rear of the body to contribute, however weakly, to forward movement. The consequence is balance. A 4-point stance begins to stabilize the organism as it lifts its chest and presses forward. Each movement is a calculation, not in the mind, but in the body's proportions. Muscles form along the midline, resisting the sag of the torso. The belly drags less. The head, already unbound from the shoulder, begins to rise earlier than the rest. In these same places, insects appear, wingless, small, likely feeding on decaying vegetation or each other. They move in silence, crawling along the stems of club mosses, hiding beneath damp leaves. Their presence is not yet a food source for vertebrates, but it marks the beginning of another rhythm, another movement pattern layered atop the stillness. For now, these animals remain separated by intention and environment, but one day their interactions will become crucial. There is a quiet irony in this phase of transformation. The vertebrates moving onto land do so into a world that has no predators, no competitors, no urgent need for escape or pursuit. The pressure is not behavioral, but physiological. It is the pressure of desiccation, of breath, of weight. The land does not force them to conquer it. It merely presents a problem: how to remain whole in a world where water ends and air begins. And so, evolution answers, not with invention, but with compromise. Amphibious life is by definition transitional. The skin must remain moist, the eggs must remain aquatic, the lungs must supplement but not replace the gills. Every aspect of physiology is a negotiation. These creatures become experts in temporary presence. They do not inhabit the land, they visit it. Their bodies reflect this compromise: moist skin that aids respiration but limits exposure, limbs that lift but cannot yet run, lungs that fill but do not yet regulate internal temperature. The irony deepens further. Limbs spread wide to lift a body that still prefers to float. Lungs expand to draw in oxygen that the blood cannot yet distribute efficiently. Eyes peer across a land where there's still nothing to see but stems and shadows. And yet these half-solutions accumulate. The very imperfection of the early terrestrial form becomes its strength. Flexibility and function, tolerance of varied conditions, resistance to the absolute. In this mosaic of shallow pools, root-stabilized mud and early greenery, the first vertebrate steps are not steps. They are postures, poses of rest, of breath, of partial emergence. The creatures do not travel, they endure. Their survival is not won through motion but through presence, remaining long enough in a place that once would have ended them. Later, much later, the fossil record will capture the remnants of these transitional bodies. The impressions of digits pressed into once damp mud, the curl of a rib cage flattened into shale, the thin arc of a jaw that once lifted toward air. But in the moment, these are not records, they are pauses, moments of stillness between movement and collapse, evidence not of success but of persistence. And in this, the land begins to remember them, not through conquest or dominance but through quiet contact, through a belly pressed to wet soil, a breath drawn beneath a fern's shadow, a limb braced not to leap but simply to hold. In the warm pools that linger after seasonal floods, where the air above hovers motionless and the sediment below holds the memory of countless limbs pressed into it, another transformation begins, not of movement, but of breath. The lungs, once simple sacs inherited from the swim bladder, have become more folded, more vascular. Their surface area increases not through sudden change, but through fine internal ridges that allow more blood to meet more air. These creatures do not breathe deeply. They gulp irregularly, rising to the surface with a slow tilt of the head, drawing in a pocket of air and holding it. The act is neither rhythmic nor efficient, but it is enough. In water that grows stagnant and warm, when gills begin to fail, the lung becomes not an emergency option but a regular part of survival. It is used not for effort but for stillness, not for flight but for waiting. Breathing air changes the internal balance of these organisms in quiet, cumulative ways. Oxygen tension increases in tissues, altering metabolism. Hemoglobin molecules, tuned for the low partial pressures of water, begin to shift in affinity. Some lineages develop multiple forms of hemoglobin, adapted for both water and air, circulating together within a single body. This dual system provides flexibility in unstable environments where oxygen levels can shift from moment to moment. It is not optimization, but hedging. A physiology built not for one world, but for two, and never entirely at ease in either. The heart follows slowly. In fish, the heart is a single circuit. Blood flows from body to gills to organs in one continuous loop. In amphibious forms, a partial division emerges. Chambers begin to separate. Atrium from ventricle, oxygenated blood from deoxygenated. Valves arise to control the direction of flow. It is not yet a complete double circulation, but it reduces the mixing of blood, increasing efficiency with each breath. These changes are not visible from the outside, but they shape everything the body can do when air becomes the medium of respiration. There is irony again. Air is more abundant in oxygen, but less forgiving. It offers no buffer, no steady thermal mass. It dries the skin, saps moisture from every exposed surface. And so the creatures that begin to live partially in air must carry their water with them, inside lungs and tissues, under the surface of skin that is now more glandular, more permeable, more protected by secretions. The very act of breathing the air requires protection from it. The spiracles, openings just behind the eyes, remain. In some lineages they become channels not just for pressure regulation, but for supplemental breathing. They serve as additional entry points, allowing air to enter the respiratory tract even when the mouth is closed. In certain fossils these spiracles are wide and well preserved, suggesting they played an important role in ventilation. But their long-term fate varies. In some lines they diminish. In others, they evolve into entirely new structures. In tetrapods, the spiracle will eventually vanish, replaced by middle ear canals. But here, in these early air breathers, they are still portals of compromise. Each breath is an uncertainty. These animals do not breathe because it is safe. They breathe because they must. They breathe with skin, with lungs, with spiracles. No one system is complete. All are partial, overlapping. Redundancy becomes resilience. Inconsistent conditions, dryness, warmth, hypoxia, are met not with precision, but with variety. Around them, the landscape has thickened. The earliest trees, arborescent lycophytes with trunk-like stems, begin to appear along floodplains. They are not tall by modern standards, but they tower above the ferns and mosses. Their presence transforms the microclimate, trapping humidity, casting shade, dropping litter into pools that darken with decay. These are not forests, but groves, dense pockets of vertical growth that change how light and moisture distribute across the ground. In their shadow the air is cooler, the soil more stable. For air-breathing vertebrates, such places offer refuge. The animals do not understand this. but they remain longer where the air is still and damp, where the skin does not dry so quickly, where movement across the surface is met with less resistance. Fins splay wide across leaf mould and mud. Digits press into soft ground, forming impressions that will disappear by morning. The lungs fill, the body lifts slightly. A breath is taken without urgency. Then another. Stillness returns. There are no predators here. The ecological web is still thin, still forming. Competition exists only in the narrowest sense, over space, over moisture, over the brief availability of optimal conditions. These vertebrates are not dominant, they are experimental. Their forms reflect the imperfection of transition, limbs that function only on wet surfaces, skin that must remain moist to survive, a metabolism that fluctuates with temperature and humidity. And yet, they persist. Their breath holds them between worlds. They're not swimmers, not yet walkers. But with each season, each flood, each drought, they grow more familiar with the rhythms of air. Their lungs become organs not of emergency, but of endurance. Their bodies carry the imprint of this dual existence shaped by necessity held between mediums. One might think breath is a simple act, a drawing in, a letting go. But here, in these pools and among these shaded banks, breath is structure. Breath is strategy. It is the capacity to remain alive when water thins and air thickens. It is the unseen action that enables every other, and so they linger, half submerged, half lifted, drawing in quiet gulps of air. Their lungs inflate with the weightless gas that now sustains them more than water ever could. And as they exhale, nothing stirs. The land remains quiet, unchanged on its surface. But inside these bodies the shift continues. Breath by breath it deepens. There is no sound of footsteps, no rhythmic fall of limbs against earth. Instead there is the drag of soft bellies over wet ground, the muted push of limbs splayed wide, the whisper of skin brushing against moss and sediment. These early excursions onto land are not strides. They are gestures, brief forays into damp terrain, guided more by physiology than behavior. The creatures that make these movements do not know they are leaving one world for another. They are simply following the pressure gradients of breath, of temperature, of moisture. But as they pull themselves forward, fins flexed, torsos low, eyes lifted, their contact with land becomes more than incidental. It becomes structural. The skin, no longer safely cloaked in water, becomes the most vulnerable organ. Water is no longer abundant nor constant. It must be retained. This challenge shapes everything. The epidermis thickens slightly. Mucous glands proliferate, exuding a slim protective coating that traps moisture and slows desiccation. The result is neither waterproofing nor armor. It is compromise. The skin still dries, but more slowly. It still breathes, but selectively. In some lineages, poison glands evolve alongside mucous ones, not yet for defense, but as byproducts of cellular turnover and waste elimination in tissues that can no longer easily rinse themselves clean. Even in damp environments, the risk remains. Every minute on land is a negotiation with dehydration. Shade helps, night helps, rain helps. And so these early tetrapods, though the name will only be given later, learn not through choice but through survival to emerge at twilight, or beneath ferns, or in the wet aftermath of storms. Their exposure is limited, episodic. But over time, the tissues that endure it shape the lineages that persist. The structure of the limbs continues to refine. Digits once encased in fin rays now separate clearly. They are thin, long and numerous, often 8 per limb in these transitional forms. They do not curl or grasp. They do not end in claws. Their function is simple: to distribute pressure across as wide a surface as possible. In mud and peat and wet leaf litter, this matters. A smaller contact patch sinks, a broader one holds. Evolution does not reward elegance here. It rewards surface area. As digits become clearer, so too do joints. The wrist and ankle begin to show true flexion, allowing the limb to bend at defined angles rather than collapse or twist under load. These angles are shallow, the movements slow, but they mark a new mechanical threshold. The limb is no longer simply a brace. It becomes an engine of low, deliberate motion. Not fast, not efficient, but capable of pushing the body forward, inch by inch, on terrain water can no longer reach. The pelvis, too, transforms. It grows broader, flatter, more securely attached to the vertebral column. In early fish, the pelvis floats, loosely embedded in muscle and suspended by the water's buoyancy. On land, this arrangement fails. Without a firm connection to the spine, the rear limbs cannot transmit force effectively. As this connection strengthens, the hind limbs begin to matter more, not as primary movers yet, but as stabilizers, counters to the forelimbs' hesitant push. Together, the forelimbs form a system that allows for crawling, resting, repositioning. This motion is not rhythmic. It is asymmetrical, labored. There is no stride pattern, no gait. Each limb moves only when it must. The body drags between points of support. The tail, once a powerful swimmer's engine, trails behind, no longer a propeller but a counterweight. The movement resembles a slow collapse in stages, but collapse controlled is the beginning of locomotion. The creatures move because they must, not toward food, not away from threat, but toward air, toward breath. In many cases, it is not the adults who venture farthest, but the juveniles. Smaller bodies require less oxygen, dry more quickly, but can be supported more easily on fragile limbs. Their excursions are shorter, riskier, but more exploratory. In this way, the conditions of growth and development become laboratories for change. Their surroundings shift with them. The vegetation continues its slow conquest of land, forming more complex canopies. The earliest seed-bearing plants begin to appear, not yet flowering, but with structures that allow reproduction away from water. This biological independence parallels the vertebrate's own transformation, though neither influences the other directly. Both are shaped by the same pressures: instability, variation, dryness. Even the soil changes. As plant matter accumulates and decays, it forms layers rich in carbon and nutrients. These substrates are softer, more porous, more complex. Their structure offers both hazard and aid, trap and trail. In some regions, these soils preserve tracks, impressions of limbs pressed into peat, splayed digits dragging slightly as the body shifts. These are the earliest footprints, not of conquest, but of presence. They do not lead anywhere. They are not left in sequence. They are simply evidence that something pressed down here and did not float. And in the silence of these landscapes, something new arises, not a sound, but the potential for one. The lungs, long adapted for oxygen exchange, begin to develop associated musculature and elasticity. Air moves in and out more forcefully. The glottis forms. The passage of air can now create vibration, not yet voice, not yet call, but sound. At this stage it has no communicative function. It may be accidental, a hiss, a pop, the faint wheeze of exhalation, but the medium of air can now carry more than breath. It can carry pressure, intention, variation. The lung, once a quiet emergency organ, becomes a possible source of acoustic presence. No one hears it. No one replies. The land is still quiet, the plants do not respond. The insects remain small and silent. But the possibility has emerged. That breath might become sound. Not yet meaning, but motion. Not yet language, but expression. These creatures do not know what they are becoming. Their anatomy lurches forward by necessity, their behaviour shaped by constraint. But as they pause beneath the shelter of a fern, drawing in air they now rely on, pressing limbs that now hold weight, resting on skin that now resists dryness, they inhabit a form no fish ever needed. Not by intent, not even by adaptation in the usual sense, but by patience, by proximity, by chance. They do not walk, but they remain. They do not leave the water behind, but they stop returning as often. And in that pause, in that held breath upon the edge of land, the vertebrate body begins to learn the posture of the world above water. Above the surface nothing answers. The land is vast and quiet, a carpet of mosses and low ferns stretching beneath a low Devonian sky. There are no birds overhead, no mammalian steps in the underbrush, no serpentine trails through grass. The only movement is wind, sometimes curling over the flat plains, sometimes lost among the stiff verticals of early trees. It makes no sound the vertebrate ear is yet tuned to hear. The air is not silent, but there is no echo in it, no rhythm, no familiar signature of moving life. For a creature newly exposed to it, the land offers no sensory anchor. Still, the eyes rise. The position of the eyes has shifted over millions of years, slowly, gradually, rising from the sides of the head to the top. In water, lateral vision dominates. The world is sensed through the periphery. But on land, that orientation falters. Light behaves differently. Shadows are cast downward. Direction has new meaning. And so the eyes lift, not only to see more, but to begin perceiving forward. This reorientation is neither complete nor perfect. Vision is still flat, still tuned to detect motion more than form. But it now includes an upward glance, a line of sight that clears the waterline and takes in the textured strangeness of air. That air is dry and motionless and different in every way. The tongue begins to change in response to it. No longer just a muscular floor to the mouth, it gains independence, volume, surface. In early tetrapods, the tongue is not yet long or agile, but it becomes more textured, better suited for manipulating food, for aiding in swallowing in the absence of water currents. In time, it will become sensory. For now, it is merely physical, one more tool to manage feeding in a space where suction no longer functions. And feeding itself is changing. The jaw remains strong, but it becomes less dependent on water pressure. Crushing replaces suction. Gripping replaces filtering. Bones in the skull shift to allow new stresses, new angles of closure. The teeth, once fine and uniform, become slightly differentiated. Small changes in shape that hint at the long evolution toward heterodonty. But nothing is yet specialized. Everything still exists in generalist form. It is not efficiency, but flexibility that is selected. These creatures must feed in water and on land. They must process plant matter and small invertebrates alike. Their digestive systems, their teeth, their jaw joints all reflect this ambiguity. Ironies persist. Eyes adjust to scan a world where nothing moves. Ears begin to detect vibrations from a land with no voice. The mouth reshapes itself to feed where food is still scarce. The tongue grows more agile but finds little to taste. Still, the changes remain. Even in the absence of strong selection for these features, their presence does no harm, and in that neutrality lies the space for transformation. The land is not barren. It is filled with small arthropods, early millipedes, mites, soft-bodied insects without wings. They crawl among the leaf litter, shelter in the shade of stems, vanish into cracks when disturbed. For the emerging tetrapods, they are not yet prey. Their pursuit would require speed, precision, and internal regulation that does not yet exist. But their presence marks a shift. Food exists on land, not in abundance and not yet accessible, but it is there, and it will not always be ignored. The mouth, in time, will become more than a tool for feeding. It will shape sound, flavour, moisture, breath. For now, its architecture is still mostly aquatic. Broad palate, flat tongue, unsealed lips. Breathing and feeding are not yet well separated. The glottis remains unprotected, requiring careful coordination. But these inefficiencies are not yet maladaptive. They are simply inherited. Internally, the throat develops more complexity. The hyoid apparatus, a set of bones supporting the tongue and larynx, begins to grow more mobile. In fish, it is primarily structural, aiding in suction and gill ventilation. In early tetrapods, it starts to assist with swallowing and eventually with vocalization. These are incremental shifts, rearrangements in bone length, angle, and connection. There is no single mutation that enables a voice. There is only accumulation. What is most striking in these animals is not what they do, but what they tolerate. They tolerate uncertainty in respiration, instability in movement, unreliability in moisture. Their systems work poorly, but well enough. Skin dries, but not fatally. Limbs collapse, but still hold weight. Breath stutters but continues. They are not adapted in the classical sense, they are simply persistent. They remain close to water. Always. No lineage yet survives without return. Eggs are still laid in aquatic environments, their gelatinous membranes vulnerable to desiccation. Larvae are gilled, free-swimming. Even those that grow to breathe air begin their lives as creatures of water. The full transition is incomplete and will remain so for many millions of years. And yet, behaviour changes. Adult forms linger longer on land. Their range expands, along riverbanks, across flooded plains, into densely vegetated hollows, where water remains beneath the soil but not above it. They move with slow, sprawling gaits, their limbs extending and retracting in alternating rhythms, their bellies dragging between strides. The body remains close to the ground. The tail sways as a counterbalance, helping to steady motion. It is locomotion not in grace, but in patience. No fossil perfectly captures this. Bones record what was present, not how it moved. But trackways do, and in some regions, mud turned to stone, there are marks that show more than contact. There is sequence, left, right, left. Digits splayed outward, impressions staggered, tails dragging in between, not swimming, not slithering, not hopping, walking, imperfectly, slowly, briefly, but unmistakably. The land does not resist. It receives these first walkers without change. The earth beneath them records nothing but their passing. The air around them remains unmoved. Yet with each contact, the animal world spreads into a new dimension, one not defined by depth, but by height and reach and surface. It will take time for these creatures to thrive here. Generations upon generations will falter. Many lineages will end, their partial adaptations not enough, but the ones that remain will carry these features forward, not as triumphs, but as scaffolds. The eye that scans above water, the ear that feels a breeze, the mouth that breathes as well as eats, each a piece of the puzzle not yet finished. And so they walk slowly, in silence, across a world that does not yet answer them. But their bodies are changing in ways that cannot be undone. The vertebral column continues to evolve under pressure that does not relent. Where water once cushioned every motion and softened every fall, land offers no such support. Each shift in posture, Each breath drawn above the pool's edge, each press of limb against soil, all of it stresses the body in ways unimagined by its aquatic past. The spine thickens in response. Vertebrae lengthen and interlock more firmly. Neural arches grow taller, spines more pronounced, allowing muscles to bind more securely along the back. This muscular reinforcement is essential not for speed, not for agility, but simply to prevent collapse. Gravity, once an abstract pull, now becomes a constant companion shaping architecture from within. The pelvis completes its attachment to the axial skeleton. What was once a floating basin of cartilage becomes a platform. Bones grow broader, flatter, and more solidly fused to the vertebral column, anchoring hind limbs in a way that allows force to travel upward through the spine and outward through the forelimbs. This loop, hind limbs, pelvis, spine, shoulders, forelimbs, forms the beginnings of a load-bearing system, not efficient, but closed. Each piece must work with the others to support even partial emergence from water. Motion is still crawling, still sprawling, but now it is looped into a frame that can briefly resist collapse. The tail remains long and muscular, its ancestral strength now repurposed. It no longer propels but balances. As the center of gravity shifts forward, the tail drags behind, absorbing momentum and helping prevent rotation. On land, it becomes a fifth limb in all but structure, a counterweight, a brace, a stabilizer, and still it holds the memory of water. When these creatures return to their pools, the tail resumes its undulations, now supported by musculature refined in air. The two modes of movement coexist, not seamlessly, but compatibly. In the fossil record, this is the moment when hind limb structure begins to resemble what will one day become legs. Femur, tibia, fibula, all recognizable, all bearing weight in forms that no longer serve only to scull. The knee joint appears not as a spring, but as a hinge for rising and lowering the body. Ankles remain soft, feet splayed. There is no stride, only leverage, but in this leverage lies the potential for lift, however brief. Each lift is a transition. A vertebrate that can raise its trunk from the ground for a moment can see differently, breathe more freely, move without dragging. The lungs expand more fully in a body that is not compressed. The ribs rise and fall, driven by muscles that now act across larger volumes. Breathing becomes more than gas exchange. It becomes a rhythm, shallow but steady, and its coordination with motion lays the groundwork for everything that follows. The limbs no longer act alone. As one pushes, the others respond. The body begins to sway as weight shifts. This coordination is not planned, not directed by a brain aware of limbs. It is patterned into the spinal cord through generations, reflex arcs, neural circuits that fire in sequence, developed not through thought, but through survival. Locomotion is learned in the body long before it is understood in the mind. These creatures are not swift. Their motion is interrupted by rest, by recalibration. They pause often, catching breath, adjusting position. Sometimes the head rises first, scanning slowly with lateral eyes that now sweep a panoramic field. The neck, though still short, permits enough motion to tilt and turn. For the first time in vertebrate history, gaze and direction decouple. A creature can look without moving. It can attend to its environment in stillness. This ability matters more than it seems. Vision is no longer solely reactive. The eyes, now better at detecting contrast and motion, can rest on an unmoving shape, a line in the leaf litter, the glint of something unfamiliar. Above water, the world is full of contrast, light and dark, vertical and horizontal, shadow and brightness. A flattened skull, wide-set eyes, a flexible neck. These are tools of perception suited not for pursuit, but for interpretation. Nothing in the environment changes in response. The land remains a slow canvas of greens and browns, its plants neither hiding nor revealing. But the vertebrate body, in its tentative contact with this landscape, begins to make meaning. Not yet consciously, not yet cognitively, but through repetition. A shape that recurs becomes associated with moisture. A texture underfoot becomes associated with stability. Movement that leads nowhere is abandoned. Movement that results in breath, in rest, in survival, these patterns remain. There is no drive to colonize land. There is no territorial claim. These are not invaders. They are rather reluctant explorers, pulled forward by constraint. The water is not gone, it is simply insufficient, and in that insufficiency, the edge becomes necessary. Where pools shrink, where floods retreat, where the soil remains damp longer than the stream bed, these creatures find continuity. And in following it, they linger longer on land. Ironies deepen. Limbs capable of lift remain sprawled. Lungs capable of breath remain shallow. A skeleton capable of walking continues to crawl. But each of these contradictions is a tension, not a failure. In that tension, structure continues to adapt. A rib shifts to support lateral compression. A foot widens for better grip. A shoulder blade becomes less rigid. These are not revolutionary moments. They are refinements, minute and repeated, quiet and compound. Eventually, behavior changes too. Time on land increases not because land becomes safer or easier, but because the body permits it. A longer excursion does not end in collapse. A slower crawl does not result in suffocation. Moisture is preserved more effectively. Breath is taken more easily. And so the animals remain. Longer each season, farther each generation. Not far, not fast, but enough. Enough to press forward when water recedes, enough to reach a shaded patch when the sun dries the shallows, enough to turn the head and recognize a space once seen. The vertebrate body built in oceans now moves with competence on Earth. Not yet mastery, not yet freedom, but competence. A structural readiness for a world that has not changed to receive it, but has not rejected it either. Crawling begins where swimming can no longer suffice. The water is too shallow, the current too weak, the body too heavy in the air's unyielding pull. Yet this movement is not walking. The forelimbs stretch forward, plant themselves in the substrate, and pull the body ahead while the hind limbs drag behind, only loosely participating in propulsion. The trunk slithers slightly, low and in contact with the ground, assisted by tail and torso. It is a motion of necessity, not of control, a negotiation between gravity and habit. The limbs, though jointed and digit-bearing, remain sprawled. Their joints do not yet lock under the body. The shoulder and hip girdles do not allow vertical thrust. There is no lift, only leverage. Still, it is motion that begins to defy the medium of water. In these moments, movement is not yet the defining achievement. Contact is. Each touch against solid ground is information. The firmness of the surface, the moisture in the soil, the angle of the slope. Tactile feedback shapes where the body goes next, not through choice, but through instinct. If the ground holds, it is pressed again. If it gives way, the motion shifts, seeks another path. The sprawling limbs become instruments not of direction, but of sensing. Their digits spread wider, splaying into the dampness, registering resistance and traction. The creatures that move in this way leave marks behind. Not footfalls, but smears, partial impressions, overlapping traces of limbs and bellies. The trackways show irregular spacing, asymmetry, corrections in stride. Yet these chaotic prints are the earliest signs of vertebrates in motion across land. In the fossil beds of what is now eastern Canada, Poland and Australia, such imprints remain. They speak not of confidence, but of attempt, not of progress, but of presence. In this period, diversity among transitional forms increases. Some species remain largely aquatic, returning to water even between breaths. Others spend more time on land, their bodies adapting further in subtle ways. Stronger forelimbs, narrower skulls, larger orbits. There is no single trajectory, no linear path from water to land. Evolution radiates, it branches. Some branches end, others continue, shaped by local environments, by moisture, sediment type, temperature, availability of food. The emergence of limbs and lungs does not mean domination, it means experimentation, variation under constraint. The sensory systems grow increasingly attuned to terrestrial existence. The eyes adjust to detect patterns on land, edges of shadow against leaf, the curvature of stems and stalks. The lateral line, so useful in detecting movement underwater, fades in relevance. In some forms it disappears entirely. The inner ear, once tuned for equilibrium in buoyant conditions, adapts for balance in air. The stapes bone stiffens, becoming better suited to conducting airborne vibrations. Hearing, though still limited, begins to function in the thin medium of gas. The sense of smell also becomes more refined. In water, chemicals diffuse evenly. In air, they move in currents, carried by breeze and temperature gradients. The nasal cavity, once a passive conduit, gains complexity. Folds develop along its lining, increasing surface area. Olfactory cells multiply. Airflow becomes directed, not merely passing over tissue but cycling through chambers that retain scent molecules. This is not yet tracking, it is not hunting, but it is orientation, recognizing when a space smells like water, or like rot, or like another of its kind. The brain slowly begins to mirror these changes, not in size, not dramatically, but in organization. Regions associated with sensory integration grow more active. The connections between eye and limb, ear and posture, breath and movement, these circuits strengthen. Decision-making remains primitive, but response becomes quicker, more patterned, less random. A creature on land must respond to the unfamiliar with something other than panic, and so the nervous system adapts, not toward reason, but toward rhythm. In some lineages, the limbs shorten slightly, becoming sturdier. Muscle mass concentrates closer to the trunk. The elbows and knees begin to bend more deeply, allowing for limited lifting of the belly during crawling. This flexion marks a step toward gait, though true walking remains far in the future. For now, it means less drag, better reach, the possibility of navigating rougher ground. And the ground is no longer uniform. As vegetation increases in complexity, so too does the texture of the terrain. Roots break up soil, fallen branches lie across travel paths, depressions hold puddles, while ridges remain dry longer. Navigation becomes a matter of negotiation. An animal cannot simply slide forward. It must push, redirect, choose. Even if it does not know it is choosing, moisture remains the final arbiter. Skin still requires humidity. Desiccation remains lethal. Most terrestrial activity is confined to dawn and dusk, to rain-cooled intervals, to the shaded spaces beneath primitive canopies. Yet those windows lengthen, as the skin evolves to retain water slightly better, as lungs grow more efficient, as blood circulates more quickly through a slowly separating system, the opportunity to linger grows. Presence becomes less temporary. Land is no longer a place to cross, it is a place to rest. There is no race toward conquest. The earth does not rush to fill with vertebrate life. Each step, each adaptation, is paid for in fragility. The creatures that survive are not the strongest or fastest. They are those whose bodies can hold the most contradictions, limbs that work poorly on both land and water, lungs that do not fully replace gills, eyes that see clearly in neither medium. Their success is measured not in dominance but in tolerance, and through this slow persistence something new begins to emerge, not dominance, not innovation, but routine. Movement onto land is no longer anomaly, it becomes part of the life cycle. A creature may breathe, feed and shelter all within a single damp hollow without returning immediately to water. The trip becomes longer, the excursion more frequent, the pause more meaningful. These are not amphibians as we will later define them, but they are close. Their lives are spent in thresholds, at the margins of water, in the gradients of possibility. They are not passengers of change, they are its shape, and with each breath above water, each slow press of digit into soil, they draw the blueprint of a world that vertebrates will come to inhabit in full. There is no stride, not yet. The limbs have learned to press and pivot, to bear weight briefly, to brace against the softness of floodplain earth, but they do not yet swing forward in rhythm. The joints, elbow, knee, wrist, ankle, bend and extend, but do so with hesitation. Their angles are shallow, their arcs incomplete. Each movement forward is a negotiation, a compromise between stability and motion. The belly still drags. The chest still rests low. Only for brief moments does the trunk lift entirely from the ground, and only then in the smallest of forms, those with bodies light enough to test a new shape. And yet, it happens. In certain environments, moist, shaded, packed with thick mats of liverworts and primitive ferns, the earth is firm enough to hold the body without collapse. Here, short bursts of elevated posture become possible. The forelimbs plant, the shoulder rotates, and the torso lifts, if only for a few breaths. The hind limbs trail at first, but then press in, adjusting, bracing, completing the motion. The creature does not walk, but it does shift forward while lifted. A single cycle of this motion, partial lift, forward brace, trailing pull, lays the foundation for what will later become stride. Within the joints, new stresses form. Cartilage, once uniform in its flexibility, begins to calcify in particular regions. Bone replaces soft tissue along lines of force. Ligaments thicken. Muscles anchor with more precision. The elbow no longer bends in all directions. It becomes hinged. The ankle begins to carry more than a trailing roll. The fingers, splayed wide, begin to press more forcefully into the substrate, creating drag lines that follow the body with more clarity. The ground remembers every motion. The nervous system adapts in concert. Movement requires coordination, limb by limb, muscle by muscle. In water, propulsion is distributed, symmetrical, rhythmic. On land, it becomes sequential, lateral, staggered. Each limb must move in turn. The spine must flex differently, undulating not in waves but in serpentine lateral sways. Coordination arises not from intent but from repetition, from the feedback loop between limb and limb, from the delay between step and placement, from the timing of lift and rest. Balance begins to matter in new ways. Where once the water kept the body centered, now the animal must manage its own gravity. As limbs engage, the center of mass shifts with each movement. The tail, already long and strong from aquatic use, adjusts to help. It sweeps slightly, counters movement, reduces rotational instability. This use of the tail is not yet conscious, not yet flexible, but its function is expanding. Each generation inherits slightly altered forms, variability in limb length, muscle strength, bone thickness, posture. None of these arise from direction. They are sampled by time, in habitats where crawling on land allows access to new shelter, to more stable pools, or simply to escape the thinning water of dry season. Those with even marginal improvements endure. Their descendants carry forward the slight advantages: limbs that lift better, lungs that fill more efficiently, skin that dries more slowly. Some individuals begin to spend hours out of water, not far from its edge, not in dry places, but in the soaked and shaded lowlands, where the ground remains moist and the air heavy. Here, early terrestrial vertebrates learn to rest on land, not to feed, not yet. Their diet still consists largely of aquatic prey or of food gathered in shallow pools, but they digest on land, breathe on land, and in time, they sleep on land. These behavioral shifts, simple, incremental, extend the animal's presence in a medium once avoided. No great leap occurs. There is no single fossil, no single creature that marks the transition. The change is smeared across time and species, a diffuse blur of possibilities becoming more probable. Tulerpeten, Acanthostega, Ichthyostega. Each represents an attempt, a pathway tested. Some remain more aquatic, others more terrestrial. None are perfectly adapted, but each shows new combinations of traits. Digits more defined, skulls more compact, ear regions more structured, vertebrae more reinforced. Together they document a threshold crossed not in a step, but in a series of pauses. Even reproduction remains tied to water. Eggs, laid without shells, desiccate rapidly in air. Embryos still require immersion, still develop gills first. The land cannot yet support the full life cycle, but the adult form increasingly does not need to return to water for every task. It emerges, stays, lingers, explores. The frontier becomes less frightening, less fatal. Irony holds steady. The animals most reliant on moisture are the ones pushing away from it. Limbs grow strongest in the creatures most in danger of drying out. Lungs fill fullest in those that cannot afford to lose their water through skin. Each success is embedded in fragility. The terrestrial pioneers are not armoured against their new world. They're exposed to it, vulnerable, shaped by it every moment they remain above the tide. The environment does not notice. The land continues to host only sparse vegetation. Trees grow taller in some areas, but forests as we imagine them remain distant. The air holds more oxygen now, enough to sustain larger forms, more frequent motion. But there is no sudden rush. The pace of change remains glacial, so much so that from afar nothing seems to alter. But in the details, the way a limb lands, the way the ribs expand, the angle of a skull as it lifts, there is motion toward a future not yet imagined. In some places, trackways extend farther than before. No longer only on riverbanks or ephemeral pools, they begin to appear deep among vegetation. In pairs, with overlapping stride lengths, sometimes converging. This suggests not only motion but awareness, of territory, of path, perhaps even of others. It does not require sociality to explain it, only space, only the desire or need to return to where the body once felt safe. For now they do not climb, they do not dig, they do not vocalize with intent, but they persist, they spread, not far, not fast, but further than before, and with each season, each drought survived, each breath drawn in air not yet mastered, they become less temporary. Their presence on land stops being a visit. It becomes slowly a pattern. The mud dries slower now. The land is greener, thicker with shade. and the air carries moisture trapped beneath the fronds of early forests. Lycophytes and horsetails rise higher, reaching several meters tall in dense clusters, their shadows drawing cooler lines across the once exposed floodplains. Soil deepens, leaf litter accumulates, microclimates emerge, pockets of humidity and dim light where the terrestrial body can remain longer, where breath comes easier, where the risk of desiccation lessens. This is not comfort, but it is margin. The edge of survivability, expanded by chance and by time, enough to allow vertebrate life to grow bolder in stillness. Within these margins, the body continues its quiet reshaping. The trunk lifts more reliably now. The limbs, no longer purely sprawling, begin to shift inward slightly, not enough for an upright gait, but enough to reduce friction, enough to raise the belly for longer stretches. Muscles across the chest and hips grow thicker, bracing the body between steps, redistributing weight. Balance improves, not dramatically, not with confidence, but with rhythm. A walk has not yet begun, but a slow crawl has gained flow. It is no longer merely a sequence of collapses, it becomes a pattern. The spine flexes differently in these animals. Where aquatic forms undulated side to side, these early terrestrial vertebrates introduce subtle, dorsiventral movement, up and down flexion, creating a new axis of motion that, in time, will become central to terrestrial stride. For now, it helps coordinate lifting and settling, enabling the torso to rise briefly as each pair of limbs alternates forward. The tail counters this lift, keeping the center of gravity low and behind, stabilizing each forward press. There is no sprint, no leaping, only a quiet rehearsal of the motion that will someday carry vertebrates across continents. The lungs are more essential than ever. Gills have receded. Spiracles, once auxiliary, diminish in importance. Breathing is now a conscious act, controlled by coordinated muscle contractions in the flank and throat. Ribs widen their articulation with the vertebrae, forming stronger cages that expand and contract with each breath. The sternum, a structure born from need, begins to ossify in some lineages, providing an anchor for pectoral musculature and helping resist the compressive forces of weight-bearing. The act of breathing itself becomes bound to posture, to movement, to the body's alignment against gravity. Respiration and locomotion entwine. With each forward movement, a slight torsion in the trunk assists lung inflation. The breath becomes a rhythm tied to step, even if that step is no more than a drag. Over time, such coordination will enable faster, more efficient movement. But at this stage, it merely reduces fatigue, allowing the creature to linger longer above water, to cross wider expanses of damp earth before returning to shelter. The skull changes again, not in size but in shape. The snout elongates, the eyes remain high and forward-facing, and the bones of the inner ear continue their transformation. The stape stiffens, better transmitting airborne sound to the inner chambers. The capacity to detect low-frequency vibrations increases, allowing these animals to sense movement around them even before sight confirms it. Hearing, once a passive result of skull structure, becomes more defined, more selective. Still, the land is nearly empty of vertebrate sound. There is no true call, no territorial cry, but the body's ready for it. The glottis, reinforced by muscle, now allows the brief closure and release of air under pressure. In some lineages, a rudimentary vocal sac begins to form. It amplifies the release, not into speech, not into song, but into something that might one day become voice. For now, it remains breath, audible, intentless, but present. The sense of touch, always vital in water, now sharpens for land. Digits feel texture, soles detect vibration. Pressure sensors within the skin, once used to sense water currents, begin responding to the subtle shifts beneath the feet, the tremble of a falling branch, the slight movement of a nearby creature. Tactile information becomes a map for navigation across uneven surfaces. In this new world, the body must remember where the water lies, not in sight alone, but in pattern, in scent, in humidity. Chemoreception, once a background sense, becomes navigational. The air carries fewer molecules than water, but more than enough to guide. Nostrils become more specialized. Nasal epithelium thickens. The forebrain grows slightly to accommodate the processing of these signals. Again, not for choice, not for pursuit, but for presence. The vertebrate now understands, in a primitive way, that space can differ and that survival depends on reading its gradients. And with this, land becomes more than a surface. It becomes a field of information. Light from above, vibration from below, scent in motion, pressure beneath each step. The animal, still low-slung and amphibious, begins to dwell not only in place but in perception. Its movements become subtler, less reactive, more exploratory. Curiosity does not yet exist, but there is orientation, adjustment, learning. Behavior reflects this. Paths are retraced, hollows are reused. Shelter is sought not only near water, but beneath dense plant cover, beneath logs, among roots. The animals begin to partition time, active during damp periods, still during heat. They do not yet hide, but they avoid. They do not yet stalk, but they wait. In the spaces between pools, in the dense margins of the floodplain, these behaviors shape what the skeleton alone cannot show. There is no sharp boundary crossed. No precise moment marks the land's occupation. But what was once a place to breathe briefly has become a place to be. These creatures, still bound to water for reproduction, still fragile in air, now persist on land as part of their identity. Not just visitors, but occupants. Their anatomy reflects this. Their senses reinforce it. Their motion, though slow and low and halting, now belongs as much to soil as to stream. And so, from fish that once swept silt from the bottom of shallow ponds, come bodies that rest on elbows, that draw air into paired lungs, that press digits into moss and leaf litter. They do not know they are the first. They do not know what they allow. But the land, once indifferent, now holds their breath, their motion, their contact. It remembers them in prints that last a day and fossils that last forever. And in their quiet presence, it begins to become something it was not before, a place where vertebrates belong. The body slows. In the shade of tall club mosses, beneath a canopy of stillness, the first breathers on land lie quiet. The limbs that once dragged through mud rest against cool soil. The tail lies motionless, no longer counterbalancing motion but settled in alignment with the spine. The air is thick and humid. No bird song, no mammalian rustle. Just the low thrum of leaves shifting above, the occasional ripple of a pool shrinking in the heat. It is not silence, but a kind of ancient hush, a quiet too large to be named. Beneath the skin, lungs rise and fall with patient rhythm. No longer in bursts, no longer in effort. Breath comes steady now, shaped by habit, no longer a novelty. The ribs expand gently, the glottis stays open. No sound is made, just exchange, just the continuation of being. The eyes, once scanning the surface for signs of retreating water, now close. They are moist, shielded from drying air by thin folds of skin. Vision for now is not needed. The creature is still, and in stillness the senses soften. Smell fades into background. Pressure ebbs from muscle. The nervous system eases, no longer mapping direction or terrain. The limbs, coiled in rest, no longer press forward. Time passes without measure. The land holds the body without resistance. There is no danger, no pursuit, only breath and the touch of ground beneath. Moisture in the air keeps the skin supple. The lungs do their work without urgency. In this moment, nothing changes, but everything is held. The shape of the future rests here, not in motion but in pause, the capacity to stay, to sleep, to breathe beneath open sky. The transition is not completed, it never is, but the body has learned to linger, to belong in both water and air, to end the day in stillness, not in struggle. The last light filters through fern leaves, a ribcage rises, falls, and again.